I'm in the wind now. I'm sure I'll be dead by tomorrow, but I need to let people know this thing is loose. I'm an agent with the United States government, and my station is Blacksite number 7. I won't tell you my name. It wouldn't matter much anyway. But this was not how I saw my life going. I spent 6 years in Iraq, signed up right after high school. It was nothing like the recruiter told me it would be. I spent 8 hours in the blistering heat. I hauled my fair share of comrades out of firefights, and I saw a lot of crap out there that would make an ordinary person go crazier than I might be. I've had a camel spider crawl on me while I sleep. I watched friends I've known since basic get decapitated through binoculars, burned houses full of insurgents and civilians to rubble, and a lot of other things I really don't like to talk about. When I was done, they gave me my papers, thanked me for my service, and sent me home. I know I have no right to complain. Many guys didn't make it back. But home was worse. I'd spent 6 years in an active combat zone, and now I was just, supposed to come home and go back to civilian life? I spent 3 months in the civilian world. 2 of those months were spent in crappy apartments because my parents couldn't handle the night terrors and the jumpy Marine that their son had become. Every car horn, every barking dog, every firework rattling in the street had me reaching for my gun or breaking into a cold sweat when I couldn't find it. Before TJ found me, I was honestly considering killing myself. Then one day, he was just at my door with that big shit-eating grin he'd always worn in the desert. "You look like hell, Hoss. Let me get you some pancakes. I got something I want to discuss with you." TJ was my platoon leader in the sandbox. They called him the comedian because he was always smiling, always cracking jokes. He was a functional sociopath. I guess most of us were. I always admired his ability to laugh in the face of the messed up stuff we did. TJ is not his real name, clearly, but since he's still in this crap and I've left it behind, I figure the best I can do is not remind them that he's why I'm here. So he took me to breakfast. In the back of a crowded Denny's, he laid it all out for me. "You got it bad, Hoss, but that's okay, 'cause old Uncle TJ has the cure for you. Got a new job, familiar work that might interest you. Ever hear of Two Trees?" As it happened, I had. Two Trees was a government institute that, on the surface, did a lot of medical research and clinical trials. Underneath, though, they did wet work, and anyone who was involved in covert ops knew about Two Trees. We'd worked with them a few times in Iraq, and their guys were spooky, to say the least. "You're looking at the new head of Blacksite number 7. I furrowed my brow at him. "Congrats. Should I know what that is?" "Of course not. It's a closely guarded government secret. Two Trees is paying me a small fortune to keep it that way. Problem is, I need someone to curate the site for me. Someone with military training, experience with firearms, and a need for some normalcy. Know anyone that might fit that bill, Hoss?" I knew what he was asking, but I didn't think I was the one he was looking for. I hadn't found work in 3 months since I'd been back, and most of that was because I couldn't settle into anything. I was constantly jumpy, constantly on edge, and that makes it hard to find work. No one wanted you doing security work or minding a gas station when every backfiring car was an enemy combatant. What would happen if I had an episode in a government facility of all places? I shook my head. "Thanks, but no thanks. I don't think I'm fit for duty the way I am." "Yeah, I thought you might say that." He pulled a metal tin out of his front pocket and slid it across the table. "Your medical file reads like a bench work for PTSD, night terrors, irritability, being on edge, those irrational bouts of anger that got you thrown out of your parents' house." I felt defensive. "How did you know about that?" "You'd be surprised what my level of clearance will get you. The therapist records were about as hard to get as a beer at a gas station. Well, I got a little present for you, Hoss. Welcome to the rest of your life," he said, tapping the outside of the silver case. The case was about as big as an Altoids tin. There were no markings on it, no filigrees or needless ornaments, and it had the distinctly surgical look that you usually see with military tech. I slid my hand towards it, but I didn't seem to want to touch it. Every sense I had told me to walk away right now, not to touch that thing, and just walk away from this unassuming little case. I forced my hands to pop it open instead. Inside was a pair of gray gel caps. "What are these?" "These are the answer to your prayers. 2 of these a day will make you feel as calm and clear as you did when you were a lad of 18. No more jumping at every noise. No more reaching for your gun when a dog barks or a car backfires. Just peace of mind. Looking back, that's probably what Mephistopheles said when he spoke to Faust. What's the catch? These pills are only available through the Two Trees Corporation. Employees who agree to be part of the clinical trials get them free of charge. But they're only available to employees, he said, with a little grin. Take them. Take a day to feel the effects, and let me know what you think. Call me tomorrow and give me your answer. Enjoy a night of freedom, then make your decision. I took the pills home with me, and after a few hours of staring at them, I took them with some vodka. The effects were sudden and immediate. If you've never had PTSD, then it's hard to explain, but it's like having a loose wire and someone suddenly fixes it. Then you go back to the way you used to be. My anxiety just melted away. My fear dissipated. My unease and dread were gone, and my anger seemed like a distant memory. I was sitting in my crappy apartment, surrounded by the trappings of my depression and my anxiety, and suddenly, I felt like I had before I boarded that bus in 2003 and headed out to basic training. I was finally comfortable in my own head. It was like coming back to a safe place after years of running from danger. After the first good night's sleep I'd had since shipping out, I called TJ and told him I was in. One question, I asked. What's in the pills that makes them work so well? He was silent for a long minute, and then finally he said, You really don't want to know, Hoss. Pack your stuff. There will be a moving truck to take you to West Virginia in the morning. And that is how I came to work at Blacksite number 7. I must have looked like a junkie by the time I pulled up in front of my new house. I didn't have much. The truck had taken all 4 boxes into the deep woods as I followed in my old compact. The journey took me about 16 hours, and by the time I got there, I was starting to feel the anxiety creep back in. I became angry at how slow the truck was going, afraid that this whole thing was a trick and they would kill me. By the time I arrived, I found myself wanting to die, hoping for death, so I could return to the quiet that had been in my head before. That was when I saw TJ standing at the gate of what looked like an old military checkpoint. He flashed that knowing smile and handed me another silver case. I dry swallowed the pills without a word and felt the inner peace worming its way back into my brain. Then he showed me to my new quarters. It was a little bunk room with a bed, a kitchenette, and a locker for my clothes. There was a foot locker for my personal stuff, and I was told to keep the place clean. I would be responsible for the site and its security. TJ showed me a terminal off the bedroom for monitoring and camera feeds. The compound had cameras all over the place, but I appeared to be the only person here full-time. Site's mostly for storage these days, but it's what we get up to here at night that may interest you. That's why you're here. I need someone I can trust to watch this site 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 4 times a year, you'll be relieved for a week of R&R somewhere. But other than that, this is your world, Hoss. That didn't bother me. I had no problem being alone after 3 months of people. What I was curious about was what I would be doing out here. What am I looking at exactly? TJ pointed at the 3 buildings on the camera. Truck comes twice a week. Let them through the gate and don't bother them. They'll take what they need from the building and won't bother you either. Keep nosy people out. Lethal force is authorized, and don't ever go in there, or I'll have to show you where Blacksite 8 is, he said with a smile. The smile didn't make it to his eyes. Don't worry about being vigilant, though. If anything bigger than a mouse moves out there, the alarms will let you know about it right away. He told me that my food would be delivered once a week, mostly MREs, and I could order anything I wanted from the terminal in the living room. There was a workout yard near the second building, and I could move through the woods if I chose, as long as I took my phone with me so I could get alerts from the console. By the way, hand me your phone, he said. When I did, he put it in his pocket and handed me a new one. That's your new phone. I'll take the keys to your car, too, and put the money in your account. This is your life now, Hoss, so don't take this job lightly. If you leave the grounds, we'll know. If you try to update social media or try to tell anyone on the outside about what you've seen here, we'll know. If you want to get married or feel like you need out, arrangements can be made after your first 5-year tour. As far as anyone is concerned, you no longer exist. Don't be stupid. Put in your 5 years, and we'll reassess your position then. He grinned again and punched me in the arm. And lighten up. This will be the easiest 5 years of your life. From that point on, I was an employee of Two Trees. TJ had been right. The first 5 years flew by. I lived on the site, spending my days working out or watching TV. I played the latest video games and watched the newest movies. Twice a week, as advertised, a truck rolled up and honked. I would check the cameras, open the gates, and they would do the rest. They would honk when they were ready to leave, and I left them alone. The trucks always had the Two Trees logo on them, and they never popped in to give me any crap, and I never went out to give them any. I never tried to get into the warehouses. I'd been a soldier long enough to know how to check my curiosity, and the scares were minimal. The food kept coming, the pills kept coming, and kept me in the right mind, too, and it was pretty peaceful, all told. The alarms, to my knowledge, only went off 3 times in that first year. 2 of those times, it was a deer who had wandered too close. The first time it happened, I had slunk out in a panic, service pistol in hand and boxer shorts flapping. As I rounded the first warehouse, I drew down on a very surprised doe who darted away before I could draw a bead on her. It was kind of a special moment for me. I had never seen a deer up close, and as it ran away, I was glad I hadn't shot it. The third time the alarm went off, it was a person, though. It was the first person I'd seen in 3 months. I'd been sitting at the console one night watching the latest Marvel Avengers movie. I think it might have been Infinity Wars, when the alarm went off. I paused the movie, expecting to see a deer or a rabbit on the monitor. My eyes went wide, though, when I realized it was a person. He had a crowbar. He was attempting to pry the door open. He must have come out of the woods, because if he had driven up, I would have known about it sooner. It had been 3 months since I'd seen another person. The last one had been Agent Daughtry, who'd come to relieve me for a week of R&R in September. The idea of seeing a person not connected with Two Trees made me feel weird. Even when you were on R&R, you went to a company resort or a company place full of company people. This stopped you from getting a little too drunk and talking about all the stuff you did for your country. It was a great idea, but it meant you had nearly no interaction with civilians. I took my pistol out and crept up on him in near silence. When my foot came down on an extra crunchy stick, he turned his head and noticed me. He raised the crowbar as if to attack, and the rest was instinct. The gun went off without me having even spoken to him, reflexes taking over and dropping the threat before it could become a real danger. His left eye popped like an overripe fruit, and he fell down on the hard December ground. I called TJ, and he and some of the other men in suits came to assess the damage. "You did just right, Hoss. He was a threat to the facility and needed to be put down. Don't think for a minute that this reflects poorly on you." "What will you do with him?" I asked. TJ smiled. "Immediate disposal, Hoss. Think you got the stomach to help us?" I found that I did, and once he was doused in gasoline, we set him ablaze at the edge of the property. They gave me a week of R&R for that, and when I came back, TJ must have decided that I was worthy of being brought in on certain things. The alarm went off about a week after I'd come back from R&R, and I saw a black car rolling up the front gate. TJ stepped out of it and waved as it stopped in the concrete roundabout, other men getting out as well. I slid my shoulder holster on and went out to meet him. It was 11 p.m., and a visit this late was highly irregular. As I approached the vehicle, 2 guys in suits were bringing a man with a bag on his head out of the car. He was wearing scrubs, his hands bound behind his back, and I could hear him crying beneath the black hood he wore. I looked between them, waiting for an explanation, and TJ threw an arm around me and walked me towards the spot where we had burnt the trespasser. "Hoss, I think it's time that we bring you in on the second reason for Blacksites. You see, sometimes Two Trees has assets that need to be eliminated. The Blacksites are often used for this purpose. It's always the responsibility of the site's caretaker to carry out the elimination. Fringe benefits, I suppose you could say." "Why wasn't I told this before?" I asked, feeling indignant. "I'm no murderer." "Oh, well, those combatants in Iraq will be glad to hear that, won't they?" he said almost snidely. "That was war, TJ. This is murder. Think of this as war too, Hoss. These people are enemies, and they need to be eliminated for the good of the public safety. It's part of the job, Hoss, a part I know firsthand that you're capable of." They put the man on his knees in the middle of the burn spot, and I could hear him praying under that hood as we stood around him. "Put him down, Hoss. That's an order," TJ said. "And if I won't?" I said, looking at him icily. The 2 men on either side drew their guns, and TJ grinned. "Then I'm afraid that these men will have to execute both of you. Come on, Hoss. Don't throw this away over some nobody. He's no different than the man outside the warehouse." Looking back, I kinda just wish I'd let them shoot me. But I guess if I had, you'd never know about any of this. Instead, I drew out my gun and put a bullet in his skull, glowering at TJ as his buddies put their guns away. "You made the right choice, Hoss. Who knows? You might not have to do this more than a dozen times in the next 4 years." On that note, he was wrong. I executed an asset a month after that. They were mostly people in scrubs, people in lab coats, doctors, researchers, people who had likely tried to steal from whatever facility they worked at. They were men, women, old men, and scared 20-somethings, I never bothered to learn their names. They were just assets that needed to be eliminated. I became kind of numb to the process. We burned them afterwards. Gasoline and fire made it like they were never there. The spot near the edge had a charred look to it for a while after that. At the end of 5 years, TJ came to see me and asked if I wanted to re-up. What happens if I walk away? I asked. I was eating dinner when he came by, and he had sat down to have a plate of fettuccine with me. Given my free time, I had learned to do a good number of things that I couldn't before. I became a pretty good cook. I learned to play the guitar, read every book on the shelf I had bought to hold them, and there was a chainsaw out back along with some sculptures I had made with it. I couldn't say I hadn't enjoyed my time here, the killings aside, but I was curious to know if they'd actually let me leave. You'll be allowed to return to the real world, your bank account fuller and your retirement substantial. Just watch what you say out there. I'd hate to have to bring you back for your replacement to put a bullet in. I ended up signing up for another 4 years. I shouldn't have done that. I was 8 years deep when they brought the girl in the black bag to me. It was 2 a.m., and I had started to think about going to bed when the alarm went off. I saw the town car rolling up and looked for TJ. He was not the one that climbed out, however. This guy had his hair slicked back, his suit a perfect blue pinstripe. He didn't wave at me, and I felt a sense of dread as I grabbed my gun. Somehow I expected TJ to be under that bag this time. The man's name was Stein, and luckily he did not have TJ under that bag. What he did have was a kid with a thick black bag over their head. I couldn't tell at first if it was a boy or a girl. They were dressed in baggy clothes, Salvation Army rags that a homeless guy would be embarrassed to wear, and they were crying loudly under their hood. 2 familiar men had the kid, and they both looked stoic about the whole matter. Stein didn't say anything, just led the procession over to the charred spot and put the kid on their knees. When he didn't take the hood off, I did it myself. He winced, but he didn't stop me. This was my place, my job, and I had garnered a reputation for being a professional, a reputation I was about to ruin. The bag came off, and the little girl's tear-streaked face came into view in the harsh fluorescence. Her hair was cut short, dirty blonde, and her face was covered in bruises. Her nose looked broken, her lip split. The blood trickled down her face like red tears, and they mingled with her actual tears as they fell to the damp earth. I sighed, looking at Stein as the gun stayed at the ready. The hell is this? Stein looked surprised. It's an asset. TJ said you could handle these for us. Handle the asset. This is a kid, barely old enough to wipe her own ass. What could she have possibly done? Stein's face was stony. Yours is not to question, soldier. Liquidate this asset, or be liquidated. I looked at the kid, her whole face shaking as the tears and blood fell, and I thought about watching her head pop like a grape. This wasn't some scared adult, some stoic old man, some praying woman, or some cursing thing in a sallow skin. This was a kid. I had killed a lot of people, more in my time here than I ever had during war, but I was still a professional. Professionals had standards. No, I said. Stein blinked. What? No, I don't kill kids. Do it yourself. The 2 men drew their guns, and I was transported back in time. I was standing there, 2 days after Christmas, watching TJ grin and tell me the rules. Now I was standing in the woods, the autumn leaves carpeting the ground, feeling sure that it would soon drink both my blood and the girl's. I'll give you till the count of 3 to kill the girl. After that point, you will both be executed. 1. Their guns were unwavering, but so was my resolve. 2. I closed my eyes and prepared to die. 3. I heard a sound like wet concrete splitting open. It was followed by a high-pitched scream and a pair of bodies hitting the ground. I opened my eyes and saw Stein running towards the town car, his composure gone. The 2 men who'd been holding me at gunpoint were bleeding out on the ground from large, grisly neck wounds. As I watched Stein run, a rust-red something snapped out and caught him in the back of the neck, dropping him inches from the town car. The red thing protruded from the front of his neck, and he gasped futilely as he lay dying. I looked back in the direction of the thing that had snapped out and saw that the girl was now a mass of red spikes, segmented like spider legs. Her face had split down long ways, forcing her face into a grisly sideways maw. The area between the teeth glowed a deep red, and I could see the eyes on the girl's face blinking erratically. The 2 halves of her smile grinned at me, and the effect was a little dizzying. I figured for the second time that day that I was going to die, but she scuttled off into the woods instead, walking on her strange spidery appendages as she crashed through the trees. I stood there for a few minutes, not quite sure I believed I wasn't dead, and then I started running too. I crashed through the woods for hours, running in no particular direction, sure that at any minute the creature or a helicopter from Two Trees would fall on me and either rip me to pieces or just blow me away. I was blundering off with no wallet, no cell phone, just my gun and the clothes I'd been wearing. Was the phone how they tracked me? TJ hadn't said as much, but I kind of figured it was. When the ground went out from under me, I felt the air drop out of my lungs. I fell 5 feet off the muddy ledge and skinned my hands. My knees hurt where I had landed on them, and I realized pretty quick that I had fallen onto the road. If I thought it might be an illusion, the headlights that pinned me to the ground a moment later left me with little doubt. I was kind of numb to the idea of dying at this point, and I just lay there waiting to be run over. Thankfully, the truck stopped, and after a short conversation with the driver, he offered to take me into town. That's how I came to be here in this dingy hotel that just happens to have a computer in the lobby. I sold the gun for about $500 and figured I'd disappear as soon as I'm done writing this. They know I'm gone now, but I don't know if they think I'm dead or if they think I ran. Either way, they'll find me. I'm pretty sure of it. I'm more worried about the little girl that's loose in the woods, and whatever it is that's living beneath their skin. If you see a young girl with short, dirty blonde hair, do not approach her. I don't know if she killed those men to get away, or if she killed them because she wanted to, but she should be considered dangerous if you encounter her in the wild. And if a man from Two Trees offers you a job, do not become the new curator of Blacksite 7. The job is definitely not at all what it appears to be. My boss was smiling as he tossed the flyer on my desk. I could see Jasper and Marcus turning to smile at me as well as I picked up the notice and scowled at it. I've been at Farseer News for about 6 months now, but it's far from my first brush with journalism. I used to write for a news source in Washington. I won't name them. They probably don't want to be brought into all of this. And before that, I wrote for my college newspaper. That's where I received my degree in English and journalism. And that was back when my future seemed bright. I worked as a journalist for 6 years, but that was before everything went to hell. I won't go into details, but it was a story that everyone said I should have left alone. I wouldn't, though. I was young and still looking for my big break, and the story seemed perfect. It was, I guess, perfectly capable of ripping my career to shreds, that is. When it was all said and done, no one would touch me. Couldn't even get a job cleaning toilets in a building with news ties, and I'd thought it was over. Until the call came from Farseer. It's a paper in Gavin, one of the largest cities in the tri-state area, but it's as far from D.C. as it gets in terms of journalism. Out here I'd be covering cattle auctions and ladies' auxiliary bake sales and state fairs. I started to turn them down, but after some rumination and a lot of alcohol, I decided that it might be just the thing to fix my credibility. Maybe after a few years of writing about less sensational stories, I could go back to writing about, serious topics again. I could fix my image, maybe find a little public corruption to open the shades on, and get on with something more grand. I could work my way back into the industry and get my name back. Then I'd find somewhere away from politics and get back on my feet. I couldn't have known, however, that the head of my department was someone who liked to screw with people. My boss, Andrew, and his buddies, Jasper and Marcus, are as far from journalists as you can get. They all have degrees from the local community college in English or journalism, but the dynamic around the bullpen is more like the one you'd find in the office. Andrew is the Michael Scott of our department, handing down judgments and comedy in equal parts. Marcus is like a less likable Jim, and Jasper is the Stanley, older and constantly sleeping through his deadlines. I guess that makes me the Dwight, and they don't mind using me for the butt of their jokes. You should have seen Andrew during my interview as he realized my credentials. He looked almost gleeful at the prospect of having a real journalist on his team that he could mess with. Case in point, the flyer he had just tossed down was for the closing of a local institution in the neighboring town of Foreman, the closing of a discount warehouse store that had existed on the corner of Beck and Mills since the Depression. "What's this?" I said, looking up from a story that I'd been writing about last week's big event. "That is your assignment for today, old junior field journalist." Junior field journalist was another thing that Andrew had made up to demean me. He knew I'd been a hotshot columnist in the big city and decided to take me down a peg with the big stories he handed down. The stories were everything from dog fashion shows to pumpkins that looked a little like Elvis. He found the obscure stories seemingly from nowhere, and he handed them to me with the air of someone bestowing great honor on a lesser. He mostly did it so he and the other community college journalists could laugh at me as I went off to chase the story. "Can't anyone else do this? I'm working on the governor's Clean Air Initiative piece." "Actually, I sent your notes over to Jasper, so you'd have a free afternoon to give this story your full attention." I ground my teeth and listened to my molars groan like sails in a high breeze. "You did what?" "No need to thank me. I mean, it's not every day that a historic institution like the Discount Warehouse goes out of business. We want your full attention on this story so you can tell us all about the last great sale on this time capsule of Americana. Feel free to use that line if you like," he said, walking off as Marcus and Jasper snickered at me. The whole thing just felt way too much like the actions of a cartoon villain. With little choice left, I packed up my things and went off to chase the story. I was fuming as I drove the 30-odd miles to Foreman. I was tired of being treated this way by people who had learned everything about news reporting from their high school AV club. The stories that the Farseer took on were often fluff pieces, and sometimes even borderline tabloid news. For every serious story we took on, there were a dozen others about beauty pageant winners and food eating contests and pieces just labeled local color. I was sick of being stuck with these nothing filler bits. What's worse is that they weren't even anything you could hang a new career on. No respectable paper would want to see your name attached to a drunken fiddle contest, and no one would be impressed by my dissertation on the Little Miss Southwest regional pageant. I'd been hoping to craft this into a new start, but it looked like I'd be stuck at the Farseer for the foreseeable future. The money was nice, though, so I guess that was a plus. The interstate was fairly uneventful, and I arrived in Foreman without too much fanfare. When they tell you that Gavin is the largest city in the tri-state area, they mean it. Gavin, as it happens, has a population of about 25,000 on a good census year. The whole area is very rural, which means there's a lot of very nice cow fields and pigs to look at as you drive. Gavin has 5 restaurants, a city hall, a public pool, a drive-in, several strip malls that are slowly expiring, and a Walmart that's usually being sold by one of the $5 generals in the area. There's 20 traffic lights in the whole town, and the rest of the roads are watched over by stop signs and good manners. If Gavin is a big town, then Foreman is a pothole. You can tell when you're pulling into Foreman because of the seemingly endless array of trailer parks on the outskirts. They have cute little names like Shady Pines and Whispering Oaks or Sunnydale, but what they amount to is a sea of plastic and chrome that stretches for well over 10 miles. I'm pretty certain that the trailer parks are bigger than the whole town, but that's just a guess. As sad as all that humanity on display is, the town is downright tragic. There was once a thriving burg here, I've been told, but it relied mostly on the pulpwood industry and the small coal mining operation that took place in the area. Now the coal's played out, the pulpwood's going out, and Foreman is a town that seems unaware that it's dying. If you drive up the main street, you can see more buildings for rent than that are open. It has a city municipal building that doubles as a city hall, a working railroad that will likely outlive the town, and several strip malls with the usual collection of pizza joints and cell phone stores. A few pawn shops and hardware stores seem to be struggling along, but the only thing in Foreman doing any business is the Moosehead pub and the small local police force waiting for drunks outside said pub. I suppose the lack of business was why I was here, though. I kept expecting to see a Walmart or at least a Dollar General or a Family Dollar, but the longer I drove without seeing one, the odder it felt. Had Discount Warehouse been that big of an institution? I suppose the little discount chains would pop up like mushrooms now that Thriftmeyer was forced to loosen his grip on the region. Discount Warehouse sat in a historical building that had once been a Thriftmeyer all-goods store. Mr. Thriftmeyer, who I assume had changed his name for marketing reasons, had owned a chain of Thriftmeyer all-goods stores across the Tri-County area. They rebranded as Discount Warehouse in the late 70s and incorporated furniture and housewares into the business model. Discount Warehouse was more like a small Walmart or a large Dollar General, and the economy had started weeding them out in the late 2000s. This was the last of the Thriftmeyer line, and today would end his legacy as a houseware and small appliance juggernaut. You like that? It's the opening of my article, and all with nothing more than 30 minutes in the car and a Google search. I did a little more looking and discovered that the Thriftmeyers still owned the chain. Thriftmeyer Sr. had died around the time of the rebranding, 1978 it said, but his son was just as business savvy as his old man, it appeared. Jacob Thriftmeyer Jr. had been running his father's store since the mid-20s, and he was still managing the store well into his 80s. The article said that he had hoped to rebrand again and keep the business open, but the bank had other ideas and would no longer extend their loan. The store had been operating in the red for years, and the tab had finally come due. Jacob Thriftmeyer had begrudgingly signed over his business to the bank and was getting ready to enter retirement. I felt for the old guy, but I suppose all good things had to come to an end. I wasn't exactly sure I would call the parking lot I was currently in a good thing, however. The building was a large brick box with a black awning that appeared to have been added after the fact. The doors were not the fancy sliding ones that most stores had, but large glassed ones with handles that jutted out from the front. The concrete parking lot was old and rutted, the pavement in sad need of leveling and replaning. The people who had gathered here looked like cattle at an auction, and they all just sort of milled about aimlessly. There were some kids among them, pale youths holding their parents' hands, and it was here that I saw some emotion. Most of them were jittering around like kids will do, and all of them seemed to possess a certain air of excitement. As I got out of the car, notebook in hand, I went to join the collected humanity. I heard the snap of an elastic from overhead and looked up to see small flags that had been hung on a rope running from the awning to the light poles that dotted the parking lot. They were black and white, the wind pushing them aimlessly, and it made me think of a funeral. This whole event was a funeral, I supposed, and as I got close, a banner fell to block the awning, and the illusion was complete. It was black with white letters, and the sentiment seemed very fitting later on. "Everything must go," it proclaimed, and the sight of it gave me the willies. A small stage had been erected, and there was a cheery man in a cheap suit standing beside an old, stooped man in a much nicer suit. He had to be Jacob Thriftmeyer Jr., but the younger man was unknown to me. He was beaming out at the crowd, looking happy to be there, or anywhere on such a day as this. He glanced towards the sky as the wind snapped at the flags, and his smile seemed to wither a little. The clouds were becoming dark, and it looked like the weather might wash out the last great deal of the Discount Warehouse. Would everything still go in the rain? I supposed it would, and I was right. I wish I hadn't been. I'm proud to see so many of Foreman's finest out to say goodbye to the city's institution that's been here since the town was little more than a logging hub. Logging hub might have been a stretch, but I supposed this was the mayor of Foreman. I've shopped here with my family for as long as I can remember, and the deals we've all found at the discount warehouse were like nothing seen anywhere else. Jacob Thriftmeyer has helped keep the specter of corporate greed from overtaking our town, and we will be sorry to see him go. Mr. Thriftmeyer himself would like to say a few words, and I think we owe him that much." The applause were scattered and half-hearted, and the old man approached the mic slowly before trying to lower it to his level. The banner kept catching my attention, and it just seemed off somehow. Everything must go. I'd never thought about that statement before, but it was a little foreboding if you looked at it in a certain light. The kind of light that hovered around here, for example. Everything must go. If everything went, then what would be left? Would Foreman remain? Would Gavin be safe? How much would be left behind once everything had gone? The reedy voice of Jacob Thriftmeyer Jr. brought me back to the stage. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My father opened up Thriftmore All Goods a year before the Great Depression sunk its claws into this country. I have strived to keep his legacy afloat, but it seems I have failed. I have failed this town. I failed all of you. And now we must pay the price." I furrowed my brow as I took a shorthand missive of the speech. This was a weird one, even for the ramblings of a geriatric store owner. The people seemed as confused as he was, but the children seemed to know already. While the parents stood in polite boredom, the children were looking around with what I thought was excitement, but I quickly realized was fear. Their neck hair was up for some reason, and they all seemed on the edge of fleeing. It was like house pets just before a tornado hits. They sense the change in pressure, the change in the air, but they can do nothing but wait for it to hit and hope it doesn't simply squash them flat. That should have been a warning, but I ignored it yet again. I was here to get a story, and I meant to be done with it before the whole day was wasted. This store held the town together, in hard times and good times. Many of you have bought your furniture here for your first place, the crib for your first baby, the groceries for your last meal. But today, it all comes to an end. Today is the final moments of Foreman. So, drink them in while you can. The mayor was looking at him oddly, some of those who had come to watch looking as if his words had broken through their daze. The children, however, stood straight as fence posts, just waiting for whatever was to come. They seemed to sense the portents, and I remember thinking that some of them might make it out, though I didn't know why the thought had occurred. Make it out of what? What would they need to escape? I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but this store has not existed on its own for all these years. When my father opened his doors in 1932, he was full of hope for the future. He just knew that this would bring his family stability, bring them wealth, and so it did. Even through the Great Depression, Dad made money hand over fist, and he was very generous with the community. Foreman thrived because of my father's money, but somewhere along the way, you all forgot that. The mayor's pasted-on smile was beginning to slip, but when he reached for the mic, Jacob Thriftmeyer gave him a stony look, and he backed away. Thriftmeyer was going to say his piece, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. It's true, and you all know it's true. I kept the riffraff out. I kept the Dollar Generals and the Family Dollars and even the likes of Sam Walton's monstrosity out of this town. And how did you all repay me?
You turned your noses up at the local businesses, at the businesses that had made this town great, and you drove to Gavin or Bryson or he spat onto the hot top, McAllister, to shop at Walmart and Target and Costco as the town died around you. You put pennies over people, and now you reap what you have sown. He looked out across the crowd, looking furious with them as they looked down sheepishly. I was astonished. Did he blame them for the fall of his empire? Don't bother looking contrite. I know what all of you think. I know you think that those vultures will be here to nibble my corpse once my store is closed. But you are wrong. You don't live as long as I have without picking up some tricks. And today, I give you all my last deal. He wetted his lips, preparing to speak the words that must be spoken. He turned to the doors, and when he thrust his hands toward them, they opened to reveal the horror they had been holding at bay. Everything must go! As he said it, the doors came open and a thick black smoke came pouring out. It was almost like floating tar, the cloud impenetrable as it hovered out. The effect was galvanizing. The sleepy crowd began to murmur and then to back away. They were unsure what to make of this, but as they got closer, they began to scream and run from the encroaching smoke bank. Some of them, however, stood mesmerized by it. Some walked towards it, and those who disappeared into it were lost within that smoke. I saw most of this, however, from the inside of my car. The final declaration, the negation of the town itself, had moved me as it had moved the doors, and I was bringing my car to life before I realized I had moved at all. The car seemed sluggish to start, the engine making a sleepy grinding noise as it came to life, and before pulling away from the store, I looked back at the old man as he stood atop the podium. His hands were raised in exaltation, his eyes cast skyward, and as the cloud pressed against his back, I thought it might reject him for the briefest of moments. Then it gobbled him up, along with the stunned mayor, and I was leaving the lot on squealing tires. As I drove out of town, I saw the smoke rising behind me. It swallowed the town in a plume of thick gray death, but it seemed I was the only vehicle leaving town. The people I passed on the sidewalk, the ones coming out to look at the cloud, seemed to be mesmerized by all that smoke. They didn't run like the others had, the ones out in front of the store, and I was tempted to stop and shout at them. I wanted them to run, to escape the smoke, but most of them seemed to have accepted their fate. The farther I drove, the more I feared that the smoke would never stop and would simply engulf everything. Every mile I drove, the less I believed I would make it home. When I made it to my apartment, it hardly filled me with a sense of serenity. I'm on the couch now, my phone ringing off the hook as the office tries to get a hold of me. They want to know the same thing the news anchors want to know. What happened to Foreman? They say the town is simply missing, the smoke cloud having cleared to reveal raw earth and nothing else. The streets, the buildings, the trailer parks, the main street, everything was gone. It had been removed down to the dirt, and no one seemed to have escaped whatever it was that had happened. They were looking for witnesses, for anyone with information, and my boss and his friends seemed to be doing the same. I guess I was the only one who'd seen what happened, and it was something that would stick with me for a long time. I don't know what to do now, but I know one thing for sure. The sign didn't lie. Everything had to go, so everything went.
Mel was having a cup of coffee at his favorite little spot one day when something would take place that he would never forget. He was sitting at the bar area, people watching, as he often did, when an older man and his granddaughter walked in. The two were a study in contrast, she a young waif so full of life and potential, he a stunted creature whose life was almost used up. His cane was barely audible over the general clamor, but Mel still heard the harsh chock, chock, chock as he walked across the tiled floor. The sight of him made Mel chuckle, though every step seemed to threaten to spill him to the floor. He held the girl's hand in his wrinkled one, and she beamed up at him with genuine love. They were standing in line for a booth, the coffee shop very busy, and as the girl gabbled happily to herself, the old man leaning on his stick, taking it all in as if just happy to be able to still take in anything. Mel felt that his interest was becoming voyeuristic, but he just couldn't look away from the pair. They were so different from the usual people that flitted into the shop, and it appeared that he wasn't alone. Two women and one of them had noticed the pair as well. Mel spent some time observing them as well, hoping to see the same interest or happiness that he had felt. But what he saw was very different. The girl appeared to be filled with a mixture of trepidation, fear, and resolve that Mel had never seen before. Mel had felt like a voyeur, but the young girl was like a hawk who's seen a rabbit. She didn't look away, seemed unself-conscious of her attention, and had eyes only for the little girl and her grandfather. The other said something to her, grabbed her arm fretfully, but she pulled away as she said something quick and harsh to her. As they waited, the little girl suddenly noticed the pair and told the girl how pretty she looked. The girl's attention was broken suddenly as she looked down at the little girl in surprise. She bent down on a knee, and Mel could see her point to the little girl's shirt and say something that made her giggle. Then she pointed to the old man, her lips asking if this was her grandpa, and the girl giggled as she answered that this was her papa as she clung to the man's hand. He turned to give the girls a slight nod and a smile before turning back to the barista who had arrived to seat them. The two girls watched them go before seeming to decide to come to the bar, where Mel was sitting instead of waiting for a booth as well. As they took their seats beside him, the one who had been watching so intently was still staring at the pair, as the old man smiled happily at the young girl and the doll that she was dancing across the table. The girl's face kept that same look of resolve. She clearly had something to do, something she was loath to do, but had to do nonetheless. It was clear that it had something to do with the old man and his daughter. "They're quite the pair, aren't they?" Mel asked, making her jump as she blushed shyly, having been caught looking. "You have no idea," she said, her accent strange and exotic. Mel thought she might be from the Middle East, or maybe Northern Europe. The barista came around about that time and took her order. Mel couldn't help but notice the resemblance. The two girls were quite dark, their hair long and black as it spilled down their backs, and as the one with the intense stare leaned in to whisper to the waitress, Mel saw the new girl look over at the pair sitting at the table. She nodded and brought the two girls coffee as she went to bustle in the kitchen. "Do you know them?" Mel asked, becoming very curious as the exchange went on. "Unfortunately, I do," the girl told him, sipping her coffee. The longer he looked at the girl, the more Mel suspected that she was foreign. This was Sweden, of course. There were foreigners everywhere these days. But she also looked foreign in that way that people look out of time. The girl, as he thought of her, was likely in her mid-20s, but her eyes led him to believe that she had lived more in those 20 years than Mel had in his 37. She had lived through terrible times, seen atrocities, and had come out on the other side. He noticed movement from the table where the little girl sat with her father, and she squealed a little as a mountain of whipped cream and sprinkles was delivered atop some chocolate confection. To the father went a far more sensible coffee and a scone, and Mel thought the old man might have made out better. The shop's scones were to die for, and were less likely to put you into diabetic shock. You probably just made that little girl's day, Mel said offhandedly, guessing the woman had sent the order there. She sighed. I hope so. I would like to give her some joy on what may be the worst day of her life. Mel looked at her questioningly, but the woman had eyes only for the old man as he sipped before adding sugar to his coffee. I met him in 2007, when I was 12 years old, and I've spent the last 17 years tracking him down. He has been my sole obsession, my reason for living, and every time I thought I might simply lie down and die, his face pushes me on. She stiffened a little as he looked down at the scone, but his granddaughter did something to steal his attention, and he looked away. Must be a hell of a story, Mel commented. Would you like to hear it? She asked, still not looking away from the old man. It appears we have some time. Mel wanted to decline, but instead he nodded as he invited her to continue. It all started when the Russian army invaded our lands. When she started talking, there was no way that he could make her stop. Once she got started, there was no way he would want her to. When I was little, we lived on a farm far from here. Our town was small, little more than a farming community, but we were happy. My family kept goats, sheep, chickens, cows, and horses. We made a living selling milk and eggs, wool and cheese, and our family was large. I had 9 siblings, 5 boys and 4 girls, and we helped my mother and father with the daily chores and the running of the farm. So when the Russian army pushed a little further, we became afraid. We could see the smoke, we could hear the gunfire sometimes, and the army was nowhere to be seen. The townspeople raised a militia, but it was no match for the might of the Red Army. They shot our young soldiers, our hunters, our ranchers, and marched into the town over the backs of the broken. We could see them from our farm. Father had not joined them, and we knew that the bad times would soon be upon us. She paused, watching as the man took the scone in his hand before setting it down again. She sighed, saying something in a language I didn't know, before continuing. We were all brought into the town the next day, some of us by force, and taken to the meeting hall in town so we could meet our new overseer. The mayor had stood with the men of the militia and had been killed, so the man who stood on the stage was as different from the mayor as night to day. The mayor was a big bear of a man, and he was kind to his friends and neighbors. This man, slight and wearing a military uniform, looked more like Father Christmas. He was an older man, his face a smiling mask that he showed us with great excitement. His eyes, however, reflected none of the smile on his face. He told us his name was Major Krishker, and that he would treat us as well as we treated him. That turned out to be a lie. For the first few weeks, all proceeded as normal. The soldiers and the overseers toured the town, took in the farms, saw the markets, met the people. The man was courteous, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. The people thought that maybe the occupation would not be so bad. Perhaps he would be a kind overseer, and when he moved on, the town would still be as it had been. They could not have known how short a time that peace would be. It began with simple theft. The soldiers came to our farms and demanded that we give them a portion of our crops. Not much, they said, only an amount that came to around 25% of our total crop. Now, the mayor had always requested a third, so Father was excited that we wanted less. The mayor had already taken his share, however, and Father told the soldiers this. Taking more would cut into the food we had for winter, but the soldiers said he didn't care. You will give us what we ask for, or it will be taken, they said, and thus we gave it to them. My brothers, none of whom had gone to fight, became angry at this, but Father told them it would be okay. It is not winter yet, and we will grow a little more before it comes. Next came the conscriptions. They told every male over the age of 16 in the village that they would be conscripted into the Red Army. They would be trained, they would be paid, and they would be able to send money back to their families. 3 of my brothers were of this age, and they were taken for training, despite their protests. My father continued to say that this was okay. They would send money back, and our lives might be better. Father had forbidden any of his children to join the militia, but it seemed the war would take them nonetheless. My older brothers left on a truck that day, and we never received money or letters, or saw them ever again. Mel began to worry about the direction of this story. He was expecting a heartwarming tale about someone helping a town in a time of strife. He had hoped that maybe the girl was repaying a kindness to the old man, but the longer the story went on, the less and less he thought it was so. Taking another look at the little girl, who was dancing her doll around the sugary confection, Mel thought she looked different from the old man who sat across from her. Her hair was darker, her features less harsh, but she was young, and he was very old. With so many of the men gone, next came the brutality. The soldiers didn't need to tax anymore. They came and took what they wanted. Our cows, our chickens, our sheep, our goats, our crops. Even a few of my sisters were taken in by the soldiers and came back with bruises and tear-streaked faces. I was young, but I saw the look they gave me as well. My father kept me home, not wanting me to go to the village, but when the food prices rose and our trade began to dwindle, Father found it hard to feed his remaining children. It was only myself, my younger sister Hetz, and my other sister, Gretel, and my older sister, Farah, and, of course, my older brother, Philip. Mother and Father tried their best, but when the overseer came to our farm one day, Father knew he couldn't hide me any longer. He came to the house, introducing himself as if we didn't already know who he was, and sat at my parents' table to discuss the reason for his visit. He insisted I be there, a girl barely 13, and I remember hating the way he looked at me. He said he had seen me in the market and wanted me to come and stay with him at his villa, saying he would give me a better life and offer me opportunities I wouldn't receive here. Father knew why he wanted me. We all did, but my surprise was real when he agreed. He took the man's hand and promised to send me to him the very next day. "Let us get her ready, and we will bring her to your villa tomorrow," he said to the overseer. And the man was happy. He left, and Father got to work. He knew what it would mean if he defied this man, and he had seen the stockades in the square, but he didn't care. They had taken his oldest sons, his livelihood, and he'd be damned if he would let them take his daughter, too. Father loaded me into a grain wagon, and my siblings took me out of town. As we left, I peeked from the back and realized I could be seeing my home for the last time. I found it hard to be quiet as we went, and my crying must have attracted attention. Some of the soldiers stopped us and threatened to search the wagon. Farah was the oldest. Father had tasked her with keeping us safe, and when she offered to go off with the soldiers if they would let us pass, we knew we would never see her again. My brother Philip took the reins, and we left Farah behind. I never saw my parents again. I never saw my brothers again. We kept moving until we came to a town where we had cousins. They helped us and gave us shelter, but I never forgot that man or what he did to our village. We learned later that he took all he could from the land and left it to ruin. He hung my father and my mother and took Farah as his wife. He left us orphans, destitute, and I've never stopped thinking about that man. When I heard that he had fled here to escape justice after being declared a war criminal, I knew our time for revenge had come. Mel had been so focused on the story that he didn't look back at the man until he started gagging. His hands were on his throat, his face puffing as he hacked, and the little girl was now asking if he was okay. There was real fear in her voice, and people were trying to help him. But in the fuss, only Mel saw the other girl, the one who had come in with the storyteller, take the girl by the hand and lead her away. The little girl looked back only a single time, calling for her papa before the two left. Mel heard the storyteller get up, but before she left, she turned to give him one final detail. The little girl is my niece, Farah's child by this man who is old enough to be her grandfather. Farah died before he went into hiding, but when we heard that he had fled with a little girl, we knew what we had to do. I remembered one other thing when I was planning this. When he came to the house to ask my father to send me, he told my mother 3 things as she offered him tea and cakes. The first was that he took his coffee black. The second, that he could not abide dairy. And the third was that he had a strong allergy to nuts. She smiled. Dipping into a bow was the barista who had served the two. Told her it was time to go. When you tell the people how I killed one of Russia's monsters, tell them I killed him not with a gun, not with a sword, but with a scone that hit a hand full of walnuts.
Attention, teachers and pupils. Recess is canceled today due to crows. That is all.
There was a collective awe from the students, but that wasn't what had caught my attention. Had the principal just said crows? Like the birds? I asked myself as I told my 3rd graders we would play Heads Up 7-Up. As they got set up to play, I picked up the phone and called a friend of mine in the other class. Kayla had been helping me integrate into the flow of Jefferson Moore Elementary since I'd arrived here at the start of last year, and I could hear the smile on her face as she answered the phone. Mrs. Swearington's class. Crows? I asked, without preamble. Did I hear that right? You did. The school has a code for crows, and you should definitely follow it. I was quiet for a moment, trying to find a good response to that, until she said my name like she might have lost me. I mean, are crows different in Ohio? 'Cause we had crows in Maine too, but we didn't close down the playground for them. She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear the sound of a very heated argument going on over what I assumed was her own game of Heads Up 7-Up. Crepe minds think alike, it seems. Crows here are a little different. I can't really talk about it right now. Meet me after school for drinks and I'll fill you in. Don't worry though, crow days only usually last a couple of days. A couple of days, I said in disbelief, but that's when someone started crying and Kayla said she had to go. She hung up and I was left with more questions than answers. Wasn't that much of an inconvenience, I suppose. My kids, despite being 8 and 9, were pretty well behaved. I had very few fights, very little beyond the usual drama that surrounded little kids, and most of them were good friends who helped each other. My own game of Heads Up 7-Up was full of more laughter than arguments. And as recess ended, we started math and worked our way towards lunch. Good kids or not, it was still going to be a long day without recess. Even the well-behaved kids get stir-crazy when they can't blow off some steam on the playground. Luckily, we had gym today, so they could get their zoomies out in the fully enclosed gym building instead. We walked across the school, me leading the line as we headed for the gymnasium, and I couldn't help but glance at the playground as we walked past. Even as an adult, I thought the new playground looked pretty cool. They had replaced all the old metal equipment with colorful plastic, and it made me wish that I could take my tie and my sensible shoes off and just go play with them for a while. There were 5 huge, colorful structures, teeter-totters, slides, and plenty of foursquare courts, some of those spring animals, a big sandbox, and a basketball court, and a lot of shady places to sit and visit with your friends. It was an amazingly inviting place, but today it looked like something out of a Stephen King novel. The crows had taken over every inch of the playground, and they lay thick upon the land. They watched us as we passed, looking affronted to see people so close. I understood now. It was a little intimidating to see so many crows assembled. They called a group of crows a murder, and the name made sense now. They looked capable of anything as they sat there glaring at us. They looked capable of hurting even me in such numbers, and I turned my back on them with a real effort. They were still there when the bell rang to release the students for the day, and I noticed that no one went anywhere near the playground as they headed for home or the bus. Kayla shot me a text as I walked to my car and let me know that she'd have to go home with stomach problems, but that she would meet me very soon to let me know the story behind the crows. Just don't do anything dumb in the meantime. I don't want you getting in over your head. I rolled my eyes at her text, but decided I would toe the line until I had more information. I had to admit that something about that group of crows had spooked me, and I suddenly didn't like the idea of just going out there and scaring them off. I don't know how they would react, and I wasn't in a big hurry to find out. I had joked that we had crows where I was from, but I didn't think I'd ever seen crows like this. I must have been thinking about them as I lay down to sleep, because I dreamed about them that night. I was walking into the playground, the crows sitting around me and staring in disapproval. Everything beyond the playground was like mist. I was standing in a fog bank, and the deeper I went into the playground, the more crows there seemed to be. In the center of the playground was a merry-go-round, the old metal one that often injured the children who went to play on it. Standing in the center was a man, slowly rotating with the motion of the thing. He had his back to me, and I saw that he wore a coal-black suit with a high, dark mantle. His top hat was lined with feathers and shining trinkets. His boots were black and thick. He was rotating slowly, the old engine of destruction squealing as it turned ever so slowly. The crows were looking at him, their beady eyes drawn to him, and as he spun, I became afraid. I didn't think I wanted this man to look at me. I thought that if he looked at me, something terrible might happen, but I was powerless to look away. He just spun like a ballerina in a music box, and as he came around, I saw one glittering eye before I woke up in a cold sweat. There was another warning about the crows during the morning announcements, but it was hardly needed. We had all seen them as they perched on the playground equipment when we came to school that day. I was working the pickup line that morning, and the reaction of the kids weren't what drew my attention. The children were disappointed, but understanding. No, it was the reaction of the adults that caught my eye. There were some transplants, like me, who looked at it like an oddity, but it was the locals that really caught my eye. They looked at the playground like a source of childhood trauma, and many of them made sure to tell their kids not to go to the playground under any circumstances. "Keep a close eye on her," one mother said as her kindergartner walked inside, her pink coat making her stand out amongst the sea of children. "I'd hoped they wouldn't come back this year. Damn him," she whispered, and then looked at me like she had said too much before driving off in a controlled hurry. We settled in for the day's lesson, but you could tell that the mood was muted. They didn't have gym to look forward to today. The extracurricular was music, and they knew that there would be no real outside activity today. I hated it for them, and when I called Kayla at about 10:30, my text going unseen, I was in for another surprise. The woman who answered said that Miss Swearington was out today, and might be for the rest of the week. Poor dear, she caught that bug that's going around. I hope she didn't leave it behind when she was here yesterday. I hear it's nasty. I didn't even have lunch with my friend to look forward to, it seemed, and I settled in for a long day. As the class played hide-and-seek during indoor recess, I noticed that one of the students was still at her desk. Lisa was coloring up a storm, really putting swirls on her page, and I came up to check what she was drawing. She looked absolutely focused on what she was doing, showing no interest in the other students or their games. It was odd to see that kind of focus in a kid her age, and she jumped a little when I came up behind her and tapped her on the shoulder. "Whatcha?" I started, but when I looked at the page, it took my breath away. She had drawn the playground for my dream perfectly, complete with the man in the dark cloak and the top hat. He was standing on the merry-go-round, arms extended to the sky, and the crows were flying all around him. The picture was way too detailed for someone her age, much too good for someone not even in middle school, and when she looked back at me, she asked if I had seen him. "Who?" I asked, though I knew what she meant. "The crow count," she said, matter-of-factly, as if it was something that everyone knew. "I haven't," I lied, picking up the picture and getting a better look. "Who is he?" "Mommy says not to talk about him," Lisa said, looking guilty as she realized she shouldn't be drawing him either. "I won't tell," I said as I put the page back on her desk. "Is he a friend of yours?" "No," Lisa said, and she sounded afraid of the idea that someone might think he was friends with her. "The crow count isn't anyone's friend. He brings the crows here. Least, that's what Mommy told me. She said I must never go into big groups of crows, or the crow count will take me away with the murderer." Hearing someone so young say these things made me cold all over again, but I just patted her arm and said that was very interesting. It was the most normal thing in the world to her, apparently, and I didn't want to draw attention to the fact that this was my first time hearing about it. I left her to her coloring, telling my students they had about 5 minutes left on indoor recess before we had to go back to our desks. I googled crow count and crows in Ohio, but I didn't get much. Crows in Ohio brought up some memes, because of course it did, but the crow count brought up only a single entry. It was an old Germanic legend about a ruler of crows who sometimes took children to feed his flock or young girls to be his bride. Neither were ever seen again, but it was an excuse for telling children to avoid large groups of crows, something associated with battlefields and death. The depiction, something taken from an old storybook, was very familiar. A courtly fellow in a tall hat, with feathers and a dark cloak. I clicked off of it, feeling my stomach tie itself in a knot, and began geography. I was still thinking about it at the end of the day as the bell rang, and everyone headed for home. The playground was still full of crows, and it was hard not to imagine that I could see someone on the playground amongst them. Could that be the hatted gentleman? The crow count? I didn't dare look too long, but I was beginning to get a little tired of this. 2 days with no outdoor recess was beginning to take a toll on the students. I didn't know what we'd do if this went on much longer, but it appeared we'd never find out. After a night spent dreaming about crows and the man in the tall hat, I arrived at school to find a group of adults standing around the outskirts of the playground. The crows were giving them an unhappy look, looking like bouncers preparing to kick them out, and I approached the group to see what was going on. The teachers looked at me guiltily, not seeming to be sure what to say, until Mr. Simonson, the 5th grade English teacher, stepped up and said that one of his students had gone in there. Samantha Parks was walking across the track, heading for her first class, when she stopped and looked at the playground. It was like something had entranced her, and she walked slowly away from the track and headed into the playground. "Has anyone gone in after her?" I asked, afraid the birds might hurt her. The others shook their heads, and I felt a rage building in me as I dropped my bag and walked towards the playground. Crows or no crows, I was not going to let a student get injured without trying to help them. Mr. Simonson caught my arm as I tried to go in. He won't like it if you disturb him," he whispered, looking ashamed that he had said it. "Who?" I asked, squaring my shoulders and looking at him darkly. "The Crow Count?" He looked surprised that I knew the name, but when he let me go, I walked straight onto the playground and away from the pack of cowards. The crows watched me, hostility in their beady eyes, but they made no move to attack me as I walked amongst them. It was exactly like my dream. The crows covered everything, their numbers having risen in 3 days since they had been here. Their murder was huge, the equipment looking like a giant crow as they sat on every empty surface. It was a mass of wings and feathers and beady black eyes, and I walked within that heaving black sea of avians. I came to the center far too soon. He was standing on a merry-go-round, the metal battered and the paint faded and chipped. It looked as if it had been moved through time, and he stood in the middle of it as it turned ever so slowly. The crows guarded him, leaning closer as if making ready to charge me if I tried to attack him, and he seemed utterly at ease. He was dressed in the same black hat with feathers around the brim, the same black coat, dark as a raven's wing, and the same leather boots that looked like they had walked across the ages to be here. He looked like he could have known Vlad Tepes, like he could have watched an original Shakespeare play, could have wielded a knife as it slew Caesar. He was ageless, an engine of destruction as much as the one he stood upon, and as he turned, I saw the girl kneeling on the hot top. She was tall for 10, looking like a woman more than a child, and when I took a step towards her, the man spoke.
"Do not touch what belongs to the crows."
I stopped, despite myself, and as I looked up, I finally got a look at him. His face was young, his hair a perfect salt and pepper, and his features were sharp and angular. He looked like a painting in a museum, a man out of time, and as he came fully around, he looked like nothing so much as a demon in human form. His eyes, however, were what drew me the most. They sparkled, the cornea like the facets of a gem. No wonder the crows followed him. His eyes were something they would desire above all else, and I wondered if they would take them from him when his life finally came to an end. Somehow, despite being captivated by this strange man, I found the courage to speak. She does not belong to you. She is of this school and under its protection, under my protection." The man sneered at me.
"You would dare tell me what treasures I may take? This is my domain, and I take what I want."
"Not today," I said, and the girl shook off whatever spell she had been under and began to hyperventilate. Where am I?" she asked, and I tried my best to calm her down. That seemed to be what the crows were waiting for. They flew at us suddenly, buffeting the two of us with their wings and raking at us with their claws. Crows may not seem very formidable, but they're bigger than you think, and there were so many of them that it was all I could do to pick her up and run in a direction. As long as it was away from the Crow Count, I didn't give a damn where I went. I pushed the girl in front of me, leading her through the throng of crows and getting pretty cut up in the process. I heard her scream as I covered her with my body, putting a hand over my face as I tried to save my eyes. We were running blind, bumping into things and rebounding back before we chose a different way. I felt like we would never make it out, that the crows would bury us under their mass and just carry us away. I didn't think I'd ever see my class, my students, or anything ever again. And that was when I stumbled out of the cloud and out of the playground. I lay on the ground, covering myself, but the crows were gone. I was breathing heavily, reaching for the girl to reassure her, but she wasn't there. I looked around trying to find her, but she was just gone. Where was she? Had she escaped? What had... But that was when I heard a massive push of wings and the raised voice of the murder. As I looked up, they all took flight at once, ascending into the sky in a great wave of black wings. In the middle of the cloud, held between the claws of many, many crows, were a pair of people that were soon lost amongst the cloud. One in a tall hat and cloak, and another in the uniform our students wore. All I could do was watch them go, the tears coming as the murder took flight and left our playground behind. The other teachers came up then, helping me to my feet as they took me to the office. The principal was expecting me, and she told me to take a seat as the nurse came in to treat the multiple cuts and abrasions I had. I'm sorry you had to learn about this way. It's why we don't often hire outsiders. They don't understand, and it gets many of them killed, or worse. I had 1,000 questions, but I was in shock, and I couldn't vocalize any of them. The Crow Count is part of the town's history. He's something that has always existed, and always will. He comes, he takes, he leaves. In the years he does not take, we celebrate. In the years when he does, we mourn. That's why we have the crow warnings, why we teach our kids to be on their guard, and why the parents are so fearful. We know he will take if we give him the chance. There's nothing we can do about it. The Crow Count is old and clever, and nothing will stop him. Best to accept it. He never takes more than we can afford. I wondered if the parents I saw consoling each other as I went to leave would agree that the price had been something they could afford. I'm sitting in my apartment now, and I'm 3 sheets to the wind. I don't know if I can keep teaching here, knowing that the Crow Count will be back again, but I don't know what else I would do. I love my job, and I love the kids, and if I can keep them safe, then don't I owe that to them? Also, I want to know more about this thing. I want to know what it is, and how it came to be here. Also, I want to know why it takes them, and what it does with them when it has them. Above all else, I want to know how we can stop it from happening, and stop the crows from stealing what is most precious to us. Harold would never forget the strange house in the middle of the cul-de-sac. There were all sorts of rumors about that house, but most were just the stories children made up to explain strange things. The local kids said that the woman who lived there was a witch. They said that she kidnapped and ate children. They said that if you went by that house at night, you could see strange lights coming from the basement, and sometimes you could hear screams after dark. They claimed that she had lived there for years and years, and that the old woman had existed there for generations. When Harold asked his mother about these things, she said that Mrs. Renfro was just a lonely old lady who lived all alone. However, his friend Davy Parker insisted that she was a witch. If she's just a normal old lady, how come animals won't go into her house? On that, he was right. Not all animals, Harold supposed. Mostly just cats. Cats would not come anywhere near Miss Renfro's house. There were many strays on the road, cats squatting in people's yards to hunt mice or snakes, but none of them would go anywhere near Miss Renfro's house. The cats wouldn't even use the sidewalk in front of her fence. You could watch them sometimes, as they stopped at the fence line and crossed the street instead, risking being hit by traffic instead of walking near her home. It was as if there was a magnetic pulse around the place that repelled members of the feline race. She owned cats, of course. The boys had seen her take many of them into the house, all of them hissing and yowling as they battered against their carrier. Once they went in, though, they never saw any of them again. There was talk around town that the local animal shelter wouldn't give her cats anymore. They said that she'd been housing about 4 to 5 a year for as long as anyone could remember. But when a well check found that none of the cats were on the premises, they had stopped letting her foster them. That didn't stop her from getting them, though. She had traps that she set up around town and worked out a deal with the local dog catcher to bring her cats when he found them. Mr. Barley was not what you would call a nice guy. He was mean enough to dogs, and most people would believe that he would trap cats for her. His son Thomas was a big brute, known for throwing bags of animals into the local river for entertainment. He'd been picked up by the police a time or two for hurting people's pets, and that kind of behavior was usually learned from somewhere. Harold and his friends, Ralph, Stephen, and Davy, had been watching the house for as long as they could remember. Mrs. Renfro never decorated for holidays. She never handed out candy for Halloween. She never returned any of the balls or toys that might land in her yard, and chased away anyone who tried to retrieve them. No one ever went there to sell magazines or chocolate bars for school fundraisers, and if they tried, they were always chased away. Mrs. Renfro was a sour old woman, somewhere in her late 50s or early 60s, but there was talk that she might have been older than that. Harold's mother told him about how Mrs. Renfro had acted the same way when she was a kid. It couldn't have been the same Mrs. Renfro, though it does look just like her. She constantly ran kids off her property, or yelled at those who rode their bikes too close to the fence. She was a sour old crone, but this must be her daughter or a cousin or something. The Mrs. Renfro that I knew would be older than dirt by now. She told the boys this story as they sat eating watermelon on the back porch one summer, and it sparked a real fire in them. They wanted to know more about Mrs. Renfro, and in their minds, it could absolutely be the same one. Her reputation for being a wicked old witch had been cemented in the minds of most of the town's children. The idea that she had existed there for multiple generations wasn't as far-fetched as Harold's mom had thought it was. So, as they started their school break, the boys began spying on their reclusive neighbor. Like the nerd he was, Ralph wanted to start with the boring bits. "We should go to the library. We can see if they have the same Mrs. Renfro that lived there when Harold's mom was a kid." "And how are we going to do that?" Davy asked. "You know they're not going to let a bunch of kids go and look at records like that. Those kinds of things are only for lawyers and policemen." The two had argued about it, but in the end, they had decided that some good old-fashioned surveillance might be their best option. So, they had staked out the old lady's house for the next week. The boys left on their bikes around daybreak and got a good spot on Davy's front porch. Davy's house was right across from hers on the cul-de-sac and had the best view of her front yard. They stayed and watched the house until the streetlights came on, all of them racing for home before they got into trouble. The streetlights meant it was dinner time, and missing dinner would make their mothers into bigger monsters than that mean old witch, Mrs. Renfro. After 5 days, the boys hadn't seen much, besides Mrs. Renfro coming home with a new cat in a carrier. Davy was getting frustrated as the sun set on Friday afternoon. "This is stupid," he said as he threw his binoculars against the grass. "We've given up 2 perfectly good baseball games, a bike race with Mark Hollister, and a chance to go to the movies on Thursday, just to watch this old lady's house." "Well, how else do you think we're going to find anything out?" Harold asked. Davy thought about it for a minute, and then he got an idea. He went inside, and the other 3 boys heard him talking to his mother. He was using his pleading voice, the voice he put on when he was trying to convince her to give him some money or let him do something. They all knew he would manage whatever he was after. Davy's mom was a soft touch, and always had been. After a little back and forth, they heard him exclaim how much he loved her and come back outside. He had his chest puffed out as he came to join them, and a smile that made him look like the cat that had caught the canary. "Ask your parents when you get home tonight if you can stay on Saturday.
I think most of the good stuff happens after dark, so we can watch from the front windows and catch it." They all agreed, saying that sounded like a great idea. Davy's dad, a trucker who was on the road more than not, was still off on a delivery. Davy's mom was the doting sort, who loved to give her son whatever he wanted. That meant that even if they didn't catch Mrs. Renfro in anything, they could still play Super Nintendo or watch scary movies in his room. Even if they didn't solve the mystery of the neighborhood witch, it would still be a fun night. To no one's surprise, their parents agreed to let them stay the night, and as the sun began to set Saturday night, all four were in the living room with their binoculars out. Davy's mother had told them to not make too much racket and gone up to read in her bed. They were trying to be sneaky, but anyone could have seen the binoculars hiding underneath Mrs. Parker's gauzy curtains in the living room. It had been a slow day on watch, and the boys hadn't seen Mrs. Renfro leave her house all day. They supposed she might have snuck out while they were eating lunch or munching on the pizza that Davy's mom had bought them, but they doubted it. Her old van was still in the same position, and the package the postman had left that morning was still sitting on the doorstep. It had been an all-day event, and the boys almost vibrated with excitement as they watched the sun set behind her creepy old house. As darkness began to fall, Stephen said he thought he saw something from one of the basement windows. They all looked in that direction, and sure enough, there was something going on down there. A weird funhouse glow was coming from the windows, a soupy green color, like you saw in scary movies. Davy said he thought he saw smoke, too, and the longer they looked, the more the boys imagined that they could see smoke curling up from underneath the windowsill. Not the kind of smoke you got from a fire, of course. This was soft and translucent, like the smoke you saw when your mom made soup. "I knew it! I knew if we stayed past dark we'd see something." Harold thought the glow was cool, but it wasn't really proof of anything. For all they knew, that's where she kept her TV, and she was just watching something weird. Maybe she was down there smoking the stuff that he caught his sister puffing on behind the house, and they were watching no more than her relaxing after a long day of being terrible. Either way, the glow wasn't much proof of anything. "We need to get closer," someone said. It wasn't until Harold found the other three looking at him that he realized he had been the one to say it. "That's a great idea," Davy said, putting down his binoculars. He looked pretty excited about the prospect of sneaking up on the old woman's house, but Harold suddenly wished he hadn't said anything. Mrs. Renfro's house was creepy enough in the daytime, and the idea of going over her fence at night was a little too spooky for him. "It was just a thought, guys. If she caught us sneaking over there after dark, she'd have we can go out the back and creep around the side of the house," Davy said, clearly not listening. "My mom will never hear the door and think we've just gone up to my room if she comes downstairs." Stephen and Ralph were all for it, though Harold thought Ralph looked a little queasy. Just to be safe, they all went running up the stairs like a herd of gazelles to get their flashlights from their backpack. They had all brought them with the idea of telling scary stories later that night, but they might be put to better use now. Once they had them, they snuck back downstairs as quietly as they could and managed to make their way out the back door. There was still a little stab of daylight left as they came through Davy's backyard and around the front of the house. As they crossed the street in a mad hustle, it dipped below the horizon and left them in darkness, at least until the street lights came on in a small flurry of snapping bulbs. They stood beneath one of the lamp lights, crouching low as they observed the front of Mrs. Renfro's house. The front lawn was covered in tall grass and weeds, children's toys dotting it like pirate treasure. From behind all the tall grass, they could see the green glow as it came from the small windows. The boys hopped the low fence as they snuck through the hip-high grass and up to the windows. As they lay on their bellies and looked down through those slats, Harold could see that Mrs. Renfro was not, in fact, watching TV and relaxing after a long day. What they saw seemed to be better proof that she was a witch. The basement looked identical to the one in Harold's house. A single steep staircase ran down into a concrete room with shelves and hooks on the wall. The floor, a flat sheet of concrete. Instead of a washer, a dryer, and a mound of holiday decorations, however, a large metal pot sat in the middle of the floor. The pot, more like a bathtub than a soup pot, was the source of the green glow, and the liquid inside swirled with eldritch light. Mrs. Renfro was stirring it with a long spoon or maybe a broom handle, and though her mouth was moving, none of them could tell what she was saying. On a shelf near the pot was the cat they had seen her bring in a few days before. "Holy crap," whispered Ralph, pushing away from the window. "She really is a witch." Harold nodded, all of them moving back from the window so she couldn't see them. But Davy stayed put. He was focused on that cat, the one on the shelf that she was clearly planning to do something with. Harold didn't really like how intent he was. Davy was prone to doing things that weren't strictly smart sometimes, things that might be considered noble if they weren't so suicidal. Last summer, Davy had saved a kid from drowning at Gopher Pond, an act that had almost sent him under as well. The year before, he had shoved a kid out of the way of a truck, earning himself a broken arm and a commendation from the mayor. Davy didn't lack for courage. Sometimes he lacked for sense, though. When he picked up the rock, Harold was afraid that he might throw it through the little window and give them away. Instead, he rolled like a log and tossed it at Miss Renfro's front door. The old woman stiffened, climbing down off her stool as she hobbled towards the stairs on her gouty legs. "What are you doing?" Harold whispered, looking at Davy incredulously. "Getting that cat," Davy said. As she got to the top of the stairs, he pushed the window and grinned as it popped inward. He slid inside as Ralph began to hyperventilate, and Stephen asked what the heck he thought he was doing. Harold whispered he didn't know, but quieted as the front door came open and a quavery voice cascaded across the lawn. "Who is it?" she croaked, sounding more like a bullfrog than a woman. "What nasty beasties are taking me from my work?" The three boys got as low as they could in that tall grass, hoping it would cover them as the specter descended the steps. "Are you hiding?" she rasped, the stairs squeaking under her feet as her bunched old legs brought her closer to the yard. Harold put a hand over Ralph's mouth as his wheezing became louder. He undoubtedly needed his inhaler, but the sound of its trigger would alert the old biddy. Stephen had begun to shimmy a little, trying to get around the edge of the house, but as her patent leather shoe came down with a clump on the cobblestone path in front of her, he froze like a statue. If she had a flashlight, they'd be seen, but Harold didn't think she had one. She hadn't turned on the porch light either, and with any luck, her old eyes wouldn't see them if they stayed absolutely still. She took a step into the grass, and Harold almost pulled his hand away as he felt Ralph's tears touch his skin. She took another, and Harold thought she might be casting a spell before he realized it was just Stephen, quietly praying. She took a third step, and Harold shut his eyes tight as he hoped beyond hope that she wouldn't see them. The seconds slipped on for an indeterminate time, but finally she turned and hobbled back up the stairs. When the door closed, they all breathed a sigh of relief before pulling back to the window to see if Davy had been caught. Not only had Davy not been caught, but as they caught sight of him, he was lifting the cat carrier off the shelf. He had taken the stepladder that the witch had been standing on and was reaching on tiptoes to grasp the side of the cat carrier. None of them could hear if the cat was cooperating,
but it didn't look as if Davy was going to manage to get the cage off the shelf without dropping it. Harold had just shimmied to go help him when the croak of the witch brought him up short and sealed Davy's fate.
"What in the hell do you think you're doing?"
she screeched, and Davy must have jumped because he was suddenly falling towards the tub of glowing liquid. The cat carrier fell to the concrete with a smack, and a small white animal shot out like a cannonball as it tore off towards the upstairs. It ran right between the startled legs of the crone, but she was more interested in the boy that was now bobbing in her cauldron. They both began to scream simultaneously. Mrs. Renfro doubled over, falling down the stairs as she clutched at her stomach. She was still when she came to rest on the concrete, but Harold could see her twitching as whatever was happening took effect. The tub could not have been deeper than a foot or two, but Davy was suddenly splashing like a drowning man. He was shrinking, his skin growing taut and spotted, his hair growing gray and brittle. His teeth fell out, floating in the soup before dissolving into nothing. His eyes joined them, his skeletal hands still grasping at hope. As they watched, their friend shuddered out a last few moments of his life, his body dissolving as he sank into the tub. They ran screaming from the yard, thundering into Davy's house as they went to find the closest adult they could. The police were there before they could finish telling it all, and the 4 squad cars lit up the cul-de-sac like a Christmas light show. Harold's father was amongst them, being one of the deputies for their little town, which was how Harold found out more than he strictly wanted to the next day. Harold had gone home with his mother, Mrs. Parker speaking with the police as she begged them to find her son. He had gone to sleep on the couch under the scratchy afghan his mother had crocheted, and dreamed about the pool of liquid in Mrs. Renfro's basement. In the dream, Davy's skeleton had burst out of it as he stood beside the cauldron, grabbing him and trying to drag him in. It screamed and screamed, his ears ringing with it, and when he tossed and turned his way off the couch, he awoke to find his mother and father talking in the kitchen. Old Biddy was kinda nuts. She had all these books and diagrams, satanic stuff. She had this big tub of liquid down there. The coroner thinks it's acid or something, but they aren't really sure. He paused, and Harold almost heard the shudder in his father's voice. They found bone fragments at the bottom of the tub. They aren't sure, but they think they might be human. Did they find any sign of Davy? His mother asked. Not really. They can't be sure that the bone fragments are his, but if the boy's story's right, I guess they'd have to be. I hope that terrible woman rots in prison, his mother half whispered, expressing more venom in her words than Harold had ever heard from her before. Not unless we find her, he said unhappily. She was gone when we arrived. How far could she have gotten? She'd have to be pushing 100. I don't know, but the journals I found will stick with me for a long time. He shuddered a little, and Harold peeked around the corner of the couch to snoop on his parents. She was killing cats. She talked about how she would drown them in that tub and steal their lives. Steal their lives? Cats were supposed to have 9 lives. She was stealing their lives to stay alive. She was so delusional. She thought the cats were keeping her from dying. The journal entries went way, way back, long before you and I were born. She was a sick woman who believed she'd lived for centuries. Mrs. Renfro's house sat empty for a long time. The families that moved in never stayed for long. They always said the same thing. They told the realtor that the house was lovely, but they felt watched while they were there. The toys disappeared from the yard, reclaimed by their owners, but Harold and his friends never returned to that house again. Davy's family moved away a few months after his disappearance. His mother couldn't deal with the loss of her son, and his house was soon occupied by a new family. Time went on. Harold and his friends returned to school. People forgot about Davy and Mrs. Renfro. A news story began to circulate, though, as the stories always do. Kids claimed to see a young woman walking the streets at night. She would lure children away, singing to them and telling them how she wanted to play. She was said to be luring more than a few teens away as well, though Harold doubted she had offered to play with them. There were reports of people missing, but never enough to spark much panic. They could be chalked up to runaways or kids lost in the woods, and the town continued. Harold knew that they were more than stories, though. He saw the woman outside his window most nights. He and Stephen and Ralph. She called to them, telling them to come and play. She told them that Davy missed them, and they could see him again if they wanted. When they refused her or ignored her, she would go into the woods behind their houses, disappearing into the shadows. Sometimes they could see a strange green glow from the woods late at night. Harold wondered how many years Mrs. Renfro had gotten from Davy, and how many more she would get before the town finally put an end to her.